2:24 a.m. The Barents Sea came alive. A dark shape cut through the fog, passing dangerously close to a Russian vessel. Moments earlier, Moscow had attempted to seal off a vast stretch of the Arctic with a sudden high-pressure maritime restriction. But then something unexpected emerged from the depths, challenging the Kremlin's plan and changing the entire atmosphere in the region. A covert special operations move disrupted radar coverage, and a tense standoff began inside the restricted area. The Barents Sea is one of the most valuable fishing regions on Earth, positioned just off the coast of Norway, NATO's northernmost member. For decades, this area has remained steady and predictable, generating billions in trade because everyone followed the same rules. But yesterday, that balance shifted. Russia issued a NOTAM, marking enormous sections of international waters, an area larger than several U.S. states, as a rocket impact zone until April 30th. Moscow claimed the closure was connected to Soyuz 2.1B rocket launches from Plesetsk, carrying the Rassvet satellite into orbit. The goal was clear. Russia is trying to build its own answer to Starlink. And we all remember how Starlink changed the battlefield dynamic. Moscow does not want to fall behind. But this time, it chose to make its move right on NATO's doorstep, using the alarming phrase impact zone to justify a sweeping Arctic shutdown. 2:36 a.m. Inside NATO's command center, the tactical screens began shifting red. New vectors appeared one after another, growing denser by the second as the distance closed fast. Was this truly a routine satellite launch, or was it a calculated test of Western resolve? The tension grew as radar systems detected Russian S-400 coverage arcs stretching across international shipping lanes. Under the cover of a space launch, the Kremlin appeared to be building an invisible barrier at sea, daring the U.S. Navy to respond first. 2:47 a.m. Russia officially closed the door, trying to turn part of the Arctic into its own controlled zone. But the U.S. Navy was not going to watch quietly while international waters were placed under pressure. It had already been waiting in the shadows. The multi-domain response was now underway. 2:55 a.m. Just 8 minutes after Moscow's restriction order took effect, the Arctic silence was broken by the deep roar of two CFM-56-7B engines. A P-8A Poseidon lifted off from Andøya Air Base in Norway, heading directly toward the center of the restricted zone. This was not just a patrol aircraft, it was a flying intelligence platform, positioned at the edge of the boundary and waiting for the legal opening to move in. The crew activated the AN/APY-10 radar in synthetic aperture mode, cutting through the thick fog and mapping every visible target inside its sweep. Then, to reveal what was hidden below the surface, the Poseidon released 120 sonobuoys into the freezing water. Within minutes, a high-tech acoustic web spread across the sea, pulling back the ocean's veil and exposing the silent fleet moving in the darkness. 3:02 a.m. Russia responded immediately. Two Su-33 Flanker D aircraft moved into the area, signaling that the standoff had entered a far more dangerous stage. Air superiority fighters thundered off the runway at Severomorsk 3, racing toward the Poseidon and closing the distance within minutes. These were heavy interceptor aircraft, flown by crews trained for extreme pressure encounters. Then came the signal. The lead Su-33 made a high-speed pass, cutting across the P-8's nose at a distance of less than 3 meters. The shockwave from the jet wash rattled the Boeing's frame, forcing the American pilot to fight the controls and keep the aircraft stable over disputed international airspace. On the surface, the pressure was just as intense. A Russian project, 22,160 patrol vessel, surged forward at nearly 30 knots, positioning itself as a deliberate obstacle. Instead of making direct contact, it repeatedly crossed the bow of a NATO logistics ship at dangerously close range. Bright flares lit up the Arctic night, turning the fog into a glowing red curtain, while long-range acoustic systems pushed harsh warnings across emergency channels. This was not just intimidation, it was a pressure campaign designed to unsettle NATO crews, disrupt formation discipline, and force the fleet to scatter. The P-8's mission clock was almost out. 90 seconds remained. The crew had to hold course despite the Su-33s circling nearby because the final data sweep was still incomplete. They were collecting the digital signatures of Russian-linked oil tankers operating in the gray zone. If the Poseidon turned away now, the Shadow Fleet could disappear into the fog, taking with it the clues to one of Moscow's most guarded financial networks. 3:10 a.m. A sudden pulse ripped across the battle space, not from a conventional weapon, but from the electromagnetic domain. Deep inside fortified facilities carved into the bedrock of the Kola Peninsula, Russia activated the Krasuka-4 electronic warfare system. A wave of interference rolled across the front, filling the P-8 screens with static and distortion. in an instant, NATO satellite communications were disrupted. One of the most advanced maritime patrol aircraft in the world was cut off, isolated, and forced to operate on its own. And that was the moment the underwater pursuit began. Beneath the black Arctic water, a Kilo 636.3 submarine accelerated after leaving Gadzhievo base. To hide its real position, it released acoustic decoys, creating a maze of false signatures that overwhelmed the American sonobuoy network. Using the confusion as cover, the Kilo moved almost silently toward NATO's blind spot, closing to just 2.5 nautical miles. Then the active sonar pings began. One after another, they echoed through the water and struck the hull of the U.S. vessel like a warning from the deep. The Russian submarine opened its launch tubes. Its 533mm underwater weapons were prepared, waiting for the next command. But in this high-stakes game of cat and mouse, the hunter had missed one critical detail. It was being watched. Russia did not know that a Virginia-class submarine, which had departed from Groton Naval Base weeks earlier, had been waiting beneath the Arctic ice for 3 full weeks. With its advanced sound-dampening design, the Virginia remained perfectly still, blending into the environment like a silent stone on the ocean floor. While the Kilo remained focused on locking onto the P-8, the Virginia had already shifted its fire control systems toward the Russian submarine, tracking every turn of its propellers in silence. The standoff had reached the point where there was almost no room left for hesitation. Only 45 seconds remained. The P-8 was now clearly inside the Russian periscope's field of view, and the stillness beneath the Arctic ice was moments away from being broken by a crisis no one could easily contain. If the Virginia did not reveal its presence and send an unmistakable warning, the confrontation could spiral into a global emergency beneath the frozen surface. 3:15 a.m. The Krasuka 4's electronic fog had briefly slowed NATO's response, but Washington's answer came screaming through the sky. To break the deadlock, a squadron of EA-18G Growlers lifted off from a U.S. supercarrier operating in the Norwegian Sea. These aircraft are built to dominate the electromagnetic spectrum, turning the invisible battlefield into their own hunting ground. The crews activated their advanced tactical jamming systems, flooding the airwaves with encrypted interference. But this was not random noise. It was targeted, precise, and designed to cut directly into the frequencies supporting Russia's Krasuka 4 shield. Within seconds, the P-8 Poseidon screens began to flicker back to life. The hunters were no longer operating in the dark. 3:20 a.m. The Kremlin answered with a show of force. After realizing its electronic cover had been pierced, Russia pushed the confrontation to a much higher alert level along the frozen coastline of the Raibachi Peninsula. Through the blowing snow, Bastion P coastal defense systems emerged from concealment. Heavy TEL launchers raised their long tubes into position, their hydraulics groaning in the sub-zero air. At the same time, S-400 Triumph long-range air defense systems along the Murmansk coast activated their 91N6E Big Bird panoramic radar. Every NATO aircraft inside the restricted zone suddenly felt the pressure of a firm radar lock, the final electronic signal before a launch decision. The situation turned critical as P-800 Onyx high-speed anti-ship systems entered their countdown phase. Russia's Mineral M-E radar fixed itself on the Growler Squadron's flight path, its signal cutting through the snow with cold precision. This was no longer just a diplomatic confrontation. It had become a direct test of nerve at the edge of open conflict. One order, one command, one irreversible decision, and the entire NATO formation could be forced into a fight no one wanted to begin. U.S. commanders had only 30 seconds to choose: pull back in the face of Russia's high-speed coastal systems, or hold position and challenge the Onyx threat head-on. 3:25 a.m. As the countdown moved towards zero, the Americans revealed the true depth of their network-centered advantage. Far behind the front line, flying safely over northern Norway, was the E-7 Wedgetail. This aircraft was the eye above the battlefield. Unlike older AWACS platforms that rely on rotating radar dishes, the E-7's MESA radar stays fixed, concentrating its electronic power into focused beams. It watched the Barents Sea with extraordinary precision, tracking thousands of Russian signals and movements at once. From Bastion launchers positioned on frozen cliffs to the smallest hints of Kilo-class submarine activity beneath the waves, the E-7 was building a complete picture of the entire confrontation. 3:30 a.m. The United States chose not to step back. The E-7 Wedgetail took control of the tactical network, cutting through local delays and pushing real-time target data through Link 16 to the Joint Air Operations Center at Ramstein, Germany. Their advanced combat management systems processed the radar signatures from Russia's S-400 network and sent countermeasures back toward the front in milliseconds. With the E-7 providing a clear tactical picture, the Growlers and Virginia-class submarines maintained full situational awareness. They stayed outside the Russian S-400 engagement envelope while still keeping their own response options ready. For the first time that night, NATO was no longer simply reacting. It was controlling the tempo, using a narrow 25-second opening created when Russian sensors were overwhelmed by coordinated electronic pressure from the E-7 and the Growlers. The Virginia-class submarine made a sharp turn beneath the water and brought its advanced Block 3 sonar fully into play. The Virginia locked onto the nearly silent Kilo-class submarine, but instead of taking the confrontation further, it released a powerful noise simulator beside the Russian vessel. The sound slammed through the water and echoed across the Kilo's hull like a warning from the deep. The message was clear. We see you. You are out of options. Russia's position began to unravel. The Bastion P systems lost their clean target picture as the E-7 filled Russian radar screens with false signatures and confusing tracks. On the surface, the Su-33 fighters, low on fuel after their aggressive maneuvers, had no choice but to break formation and return towards Severomorsk 3:40 a.m. As the electronic chaos began to fade, something far more serious appeared on Russia's long-range radar. A U.S. carrier strike group, led by the Gerald R. Ford-class supercarrier, had moved into position near the edge of the exclusion zone. This was not just a show of presence. It was a strategic warning. The Kremlin suddenly understood the scale of the situation. This was no longer about one patrol aircraft, one submarine, or one restricted zone. Russia had not simply lost control of a single encounter, it had lost the initiative across the entire Arctic chessboard. 4:15 a.m. While Russia's northern fleet struggled with disrupted systems and shaken command confidence, NATO moved to deliver the decisive result. The Shadow Fleet, the oil tankers that quietly supported Moscow's financial lifeline, was now isolated. Satellite links were down. Escort vessels had lost coordination. The entire formation was exposed. NATO activated the Divert and Detain Protocol. John Mayen-class patrol ships and MH-60 Seahawk helicopters closed in on the tanker group at high speed. Searchlights cut through the Arctic darkness, while firm instructions were transmitted across open channels. With no reliable contact from Moscow and NATO forces surrounding their route, the tankers were forced to change course toward a Norwegian port for a special security inspection. Russian warships, held in place by the presence of the U.S. strike group, could only observe as the plan collapsed. Russia's gamble had failed. 5 a.m. The historic turning point did not come through a massive exchange of fire. It came through total control. The U.S. carrier strike group now dominated every exit route from the Barents Sea. Russia eventually launched the Soyuz 2.1B rocket, but the moment felt empty. Moscow had achieved the launch, yet lost control of the wider Arctic situation. The invisible wall had been broken without a single direct shot. But one question remains. What if Russia had pushed further and authorized a launch against NATO forces? According to the scenario, NATO had already prepared the silent blackout response. If a Russian system crossed the final line, NATO could deploy high-altitude electronic disruption measures over the Murmansk region, temporarily crippling the sensors and command networks of the Northern Fleet. In modern warfare, a fleet without electronics is no longer a force in motion. It becomes blind, isolated, and vulnerable. So the real question is this: would Russia ever dare to test the limits of America's electronic warfare capability in the Arctic? Share your thoughts in the comments.